Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. We have some tapas that have just been delivered from La Isla, and cookies and some coffee and tea. So welcome, everyone. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming tonight. And I have to tell you, I'm really taken by your presence, by the flowers, and by some of the calls and emails I got during the day. So welcome and thank you to all of you. I want to thank a few people particularly. First of all, the Hoboken Public Library. They invited us here tonight, and I'd like to officially thank them. And it was through Joanne Serrano's invitation. Joanne, would you just raise your hand so everybody knows who you are? Joanne and her husband Leo and I are high school friends, and Leo and Joanne bumped into me back, I think it was May or June, and Joanne asked that question, John, what have you been doing? And a month earlier I finished writing this book. So my answer was, I just finished writing a book. And she then said to me, would you like to come and speak at the library? I think at the time, or now, she's the president of the board of directors. We'd like to invite you. So I said, I'd love to. And she said, what's the book about? And I gave her a brief idea what it's about. Also, thank you, Joanne. I want to thank Lena Poles, who's the director of the library, and Matt Latham. Matt is in the back. He's the gentleman who is in charge of special programs such as this, and he set up the room and made sure we have hot water for coffee and tea, and has been very hospitable to me during the month or so since I first met him. So thank you, Matt. And always a special thank you to each and every one of you. Some of you are my neighbors, some of you are my boyhood friends, some of you are former students of mine. One of you who just walked in is my attorney, John Goldsmith. So we have quite an assemblage, and Joanne knows John Goldsmith as I do. Thank you all for coming. I want to fill this room with gratitude, because that's what I have. I have so much gratitude for being allowed to write this book, and for having you come here this evening. And I'd like tonight to be more a discussion between friends, rather than a teacher, me, and students, you, as a classroom. I'd rather have us think as though we're seated in my living room on 7th and Bloomfield, and we're talking about my latest project and how you're involved in it. So if we could have that kind of an environment or climate, that would make me very, very happy. So please put that in your mind. We're in my living room. We're not in the Hoboken Public Library. What's the book about? Well, you see the title over here. I had this done Sunday at the office on 3rd and Washington Street. The title is Thinking in English. And just to give you a little brief idea what it is, it's an ESL book. It's 160 pages. And to a publisher, that doesn't mean much, because publishers talk in terms of words. Because a page could be this big, it could be this big, it could be a coffee table book. This book is 40,000 words. That's what equals 160 pages. And it's about cultural immersion using intuitive intelligence of the student. Now, the other day I passed the Hoboken Charter School on 8th and Washington, and there's some of your children who attend that. Who has a child or children who attend it? Yeah. And I know Chris Minori has one of his children. Chris would have been here tonight. He's one of my neighbors. There's a great motto that they have, and that motto explains the theme and purpose of my book. The motto is, where children come first and learning comes naturally. I'll say that again. Where children come first and learning comes naturally. That's what my book is about. And in the morning, I take this 5,000-step exercise program around Hoboken. And I noticed that just a couple days ago as I was walking past the Hoboken Charter School, which is where Sacred Heart Academy used to be, for those of you who've been in Hoboken a while. Learning comes naturally. When I look at the ESL books, I find that they're so artificial, and they teach too much grammar, nouns and verbs, and then after a year or 2 or 3, the student still can't speak English, or is so afraid to pronounce because they'll be laughed at. He or she keeps their mouths closed. That's not what ESL is supposed to be about. I think if you realize the fact that I was an English teacher in Palisade Park for a number of years, and I left there as a vice principal in 2000. And then what I decided to do was to open up an ESL school. And I did that in Fort Lee. And I've had that opened up until the spring of this year. And during a certain period, from 2004 to about 2009, I worked at a wonderful place called South Pole. And I say wonderful place because it had about 400 people. About 395 were Korean Americans, and the other 5 were something other than Korean Americans. But it was there that I really got involved in the Korean culture. And I was allowed to become friends with my students. And a number of times we had dinner parties in my house, and Nick and Olga and Ciara Calabrese, Nick, just raise your hands so everybody sees who you are. They were part of the dinner, and they made my students feel very comfortable. We would have 12, 15 students around my dining room table. And I remember one time there was a student who asked, he actually raised his hand at dinner. He said, "Dr. Muchacha." I said, "Yes." His name was Mr. Lee. I said, "Yes, Mr. Lee." Chungo Lee. I said, he said to me, "You are the first American to invite me in his house. And I've lived here for 9 years." Wow. What a feeling of gratitude that was also, to feel as though that I actually brought him in my house and he felt comfortable to say that. Do any of you have questions? Talk to me. If you have a comment or a question, please say it. So when I worked at South Pole from about 2004 to 2009, just about a year ago, they stopped the ESL program. I really felt as though this book was writing me instead of me writing the book. And I would go home at the end of the day and I would write things down, and it's as though they just kept flowing out of me. And they were very different from what I would see in the ESL books that I was using. They were different in the sense that the experiences I had were human, person to person. And the ESL books were not allowing me to have that human contact. So I was very happy about South Pole. I mean, South Pole came to me. They called me one day in 2004 and they said, "We would like you to be the English tutor." And it was almost full-time employment for me at one address for 5 years. So I was very, very fortunate. And when I was at South Pole, I met some highly educated Koreans, and they knew grammar. They knew nouns and verbs and subjects better than I did. But yet, they couldn't speak. And that's where my investigation began, and I started to think about how I could maybe do something better. And that's what I mean when I say the book wrote me. Because every day I would go home and I would write a page or 3 pages or 5 pages, and before you knew it, I realized that I had a book. A friend of mine said, "You know, you have a book." But in writing the book, it's funny how the human mind works. I decided that to write the book, I would need a writing table. So I spent 5 or 6 weeks going to furniture stores looking to buy a writing table. And then I realized this is absurd. It's an excuse not to write the book. I mean, I had written a doctoral dissertation at a kitchen table a few years earlier. Why couldn't I write a book at the same kitchen table? And I realized what my mind was doing to me. I was coming up with excuses not to do something that was knocking at the door to come out. So I would sit down at my kitchen table every night and I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote. And I realized so many of my students were kind of like my grandmother in this sense. I had a Sicilian grandmother who was born in Palermo and came here when she was about 19. And probably within a year she met the man who would become my grandfather. My grandmother's name was Vincenza. Vincenza. And she married Giuseppe Galeotto. Can you get more Italian than that? And they settled in a beautiful town near Newark Airport called Bloomfield. And they lived on a one-block street called Columbus Street. It's in the book, by the way. I have a whole section about my grandmother and grandfather. And on this block there were 12 houses. 10 of them were occupied by Sicilian Americans. The other 2 families, they kind of led on the block. And every one of the Sicilians were in the same business, including my grandfather. They were in the wholesale banana business. They imported bananas from South America, and they would sell them to small grocery stores and to big supermarkets. And that's the way my grandfather made his living. And he raised 10 children. My mother was one of 10. And I'm one of 27 grandchildren. But my grandmother and grandfather had 2 very different lives. My grandmother stayed in the house all day. She read El Progresso Americano, the Italian newspaper. She went to a church where the priest was Italian and said the Mass in Italian. She went to a butcher who only spoke the Sicilian dialect. She went to a grocery store where only the grocer spoke Sicilian dialect. Does it sound like Palisades Park a little bit? It was the Sicilian equivalent of Palisade Park, which is where so many Koreans have settled. Now, my grandfather, on the other hand, since he was a businessman, he had to deal with American wholesalers and American shop owners and American supermarket managers. So my grandfather spoke English. He wrote enough English, certainly, to write his name. He had to sign contracts. And he was more Americanized. Then he would go home to his wife, my grandmother, and she was still in Palermo, Sicily, in Bloomfield, New Jersey. And that's so true of so many immigrants in this country now, 80 years later. See how the book was coming out of me? I would see in my students what I saw in my grandparents and what I heard about their lives were like 80 years ago. I also, in the book, and you know, you can't get the whole idea of the book tonight. I could give you a gist of the book. And a gist of the book is probably all we could do in an hour's time. I talk about somebody named Antonio Banderas. You all know Antonio Banderas, right? A terrific actor. And I dedicate a good part of the chapter to Antonio, because Antonio learned English the way I'm teaching English in this book. And I said the right name because Martin over here is from Spain. And you know, Antonio Banderas made headlines in Spain. He came here in 1992 to make the Mambo Kings. Remember that movie? The Mambo Kings? And he got great reviews because of his presence, his acting ability. But some of the critics said he spoke the English words as though he didn't understand English. And they were absolutely correct. He learned his English lines the day before shooting, and he phonetically spit them out. So the real perceptive critics knew that Antonio didn't know his English. So when he finishes that movie, he realized that he had a career in American movies and Hollywood. And the studio wanted to send him to Berlitz language school, but he decided not to do that. He decided to culturally immerse himself. And this is what he did. He wasn't that well known, because he had only done one American movie. He wasn't that well known in America. So he threw himself into American coffee shops in Los Angeles, laundromats, restaurants, and he just threw himself by himself so that he'd have to learn English. Now, being a very handsome man certainly helped him with the women, because all the women in the laundromats and the coffee shops and the restaurants wanted to come over to this poor stranger who was struggling with English, and they wanted to help him. He learned through the cultural immersion method, which is exactly what I'm presenting in this book. And by the way, we've been offered a contract, and we're hoping that the book will be published sometime early in spring 2011. I didn't say 2012, I said 2011. Okay? Because this project has been a 5-year project. I also want to talk about, if you live in Hoboken or you know Hoboken, the people who own Davis Stationery, 638 Washington Street. They've owned it for the last 15 years. They're an Indian couple, Bamini and Minaj. And I go in there very often, if not every day, almost every day. And over the years, I've talked to them about, how did you learn English? And they tell me the same thing that I read from Antonio Banderas and other successful people. They became culturally immersed. If you were to speak to Bamini and Minaj, Bamini's the wife, Minaj is the husband, you could hardly detect an accent. That's how good they are. And they learn through cultural immersion. Minaj, the husband, now has a job with the United States Postal Service. Now, I've never said English is a requisite to work for the Postal Service, but you have to have at least a passing knowledge of English. I also want to mention my father. My father came here when he was 8 years old. And he came from mainland Italy. He came from a little city called Trani, which is in the province of Bari on the Southeast Asiatic coast. My father never took ESL. Had you met my father, you would have heard no accent. He was in the dental business all his life. Now, there's at least one person in this audience, Vincent Wassman. Vincent, raise your hands, everybody, who knew my mom and dad very well. And if I had said my dad was born in America, you might very well have said, sure, he was born in America, because he had no accent. So cultural immersion using this intuitive process works very well. Talk to me, ask me something. Please, Regina.
Because you address and your experience has been with the Korean community,
Yeah.
is this method appropriate for every non-English speaking?
That's a great question. ESL is appropriate for anybody. My concentration has been with Hispanics, some Russians, some Indians, and a lot of Asians, particularly Koreans, but also Japanese. That's been my concentration. My ESL school's in Fort Lee. Fort Lee is half Asian and half Jewish. And the Jews I've met don't need ESL. Okay? At least I haven't met them. So that's where I was. That was my population. That's a great, great question. And you know, I go by Don Hewitt's philosophy. You know Don Hewitt, the producer of 60 Minutes TV show. I think that's been on 40-something years. Don Hewitt was once asked, what's the secret of your success? He said very simply, 4 words, tell me a story. So in this book, what I do, I tell anecdotal stories about Antonio Banderas, about Minaj and Bimini, about my father, about other people, some Korean, some Japanese, whom I met. How about the Korean student I had who had a PhD in chemistry? He was considered one of the greatest chemists in the world. He and his wife and 2 daughters go into Baskin Robbins in Long Island where he lived. He lived in New Hyde Park. And he asked the clerk for a vanilla ice cream cone. The clerk was 16 years old and said, what? So Professor Park said, I'd like a vanilla ice cream cone. The 16-year-old clerk said, what are you talking about? What language is that? At this point, Dr. Park turned around and with his wife and 2 daughters walked out of the ice cream shop, very embarrassed by the experience they had. Now, of course, we all would agree that if that clerk had some polish to him, he might have said, could you point to the name of the flavor you'd like? And when Dr. Park told me this story, I said, tell it to me the way you told it to this clerk. And he said, vanilla. I could understand him. So sometimes if you meet a person who maybe isn't as tolerant, as understanding, you have an experience that embarrasses you. That's why that's one of the anecdotes in my book. This book is about hope. This book is not just ESL. Because the one thing I found among all my students, we all need hope. We all need encouragement. We all need the feeling that we're not alone. I mean, think of some of the students I've mentioned. Some of the Hispanic, some of the Indian, some of the Russian, some of the Asian, Korean, or Japanese. They're 6,000, 8,000, 10,000 miles from home. A new culture, new language, new food. They have trouble initially finding a store where they can buy their food. What an obstacle that is, to be in a foreign country. I don't know if I could do it. So I put in a lot of hope and encouragement in my book. So it's not just about teaching ESL. You know, I remember once at South Pole, after class, one of the students came up to me, Jeff Troy, and he said to me, Dr. Muchacho, you teach 2 things here. And I hesitated for a moment, and then I realized what the second thing was. The first thing, of course, was ESL. He said to me, you also teach positive thinking. This book is about positive thinking. This book is about having you realize that we're all one. Even though some people may try to fool you to think we're separate, or they may think we're separate, we're all one. We're all connected. And there's really no stranger. It's just somebody you haven't met. And I can't tell you how wonderful I felt when Chung Bu Lee said to me in my house, you're the first American to invite me into his home, and I've lived here for a number of years. What a wonderful feeling that was. Now, I thought in 2007, doesn't anybody want to say anything? John Goldsmith.
When you were teaching,
yes,
and you were coming to this realization that the preferred method of learning English as a second language was this cultural immersion, how did you translate that into a curriculum? What did you tell your students to do?
excellent question.
Thank you. Do I get a high five or not?
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. I'm going to come back and give you a high five. What I did Actually, there's a student in this room right now who, along with me, we did it. Jen Choi. What we did, we went every week to a different restaurant, which is one thing we did. And the week before we went to that restaurant, we looked at the menu in English, we studied the menu in English, and then we talked about the different dishes. That's one thing we can do. Another thing is, I always encourage my students to go to the American movie. And more times than not, they'll say to me, but how can I go to see an American movie? I don't understand much. And I say, okay, go once a month. The second month you go, you'll probably understand more than you did the first month. And I'll recommend movies for you to see, movies that I think would be helpful. I also have a list of TV programs that I recommend. Oprah is always on my list. She's one of several. And now if you miss the actual time, you can see most TV shows on your computer, which is great. News shows I recommend. Jay Lee, you look very handsome tonight. I want to tell you that. You look terrific in that outfit. And it's so nice to see you from Scarsdale. And I do things like that, John. And I have a list of things that I not only give to my students, I encourage them to do and to utilize. And so many of my students, and here's one thing that costs you nothing. So many of my students do not go to American supermarkets. Among the Korean community and the Asian community, you have Hanarum and Mitsuo. Okay? I encourage them to go to an A&P. Go to a ShopRite. Get a carriage and push it around. You don't have to put anything in the carriage, just push it around. You're getting to see what Americans buy, what they eat. You're smelling the smells. This is exactly what I did in 1985. When Koreans started to move into Palisade Park and I was a classroom teacher, I went to the Korean grocery store and I would just walk around. I had a little trouble with kimchi at first. I have to tell you that. Kimchi's a little strong. But if you know what people eat, then you have such a great idea about the culture of people. Because food is so important. Generally, you eat 3 times a day. So my feeling was to get to know the food. And I've done that with other cultures, not just Korean. So, great question. Thank you. And a long answer, but I hope I answered it correctly. In 2007, I thought I was finished with the book. So I wanted to go to an exotic place to finish the last chapter. You know the way they do in the movies? You know, right? What was it, the movie Misery, where Jimmy Kahn goes to the same hotel he goes to all the time to finish the last chapter? Of course, what happened to him, we don't want to happen to anybody, but and what a wonderful laugh. Isn't that that's an infectious laugh that Roger has. So I had a picture in my home office of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And I knew there was one person in Hoboken who was an expert on Jackson Hole, Armando, Annabelle's husband. So I called him up. I said, Armando, I want to go to Jackson Hole. I'm finishing my book. Actually, it was January 2007. I want to go next month in February. He said to me, it's not that easy to get to Jackson Hole. And we like it like that. I said, what do you mean it's not that easy? You can't fly directly. You have to go to Chicago, or I think once I went to Texas. Imagine Newark to Texas to Jackson Hole. I said, that's okay. I'm intent to go. I'll find my way. So February 2007, thinking I'm going there to finish my book, unaware that I have 3 more years of writing, I fly to Jackson Hole. February in Jackson Hole is about 5 feet of snow. And that was a year when the snow was low. That year, 2007, it was a low snow year. I get there and I'm in this magical place First of all, I was so naive, I thought Jackson Hole meant there was a hole in the ground. Never realizing that it's simply the area between a mountainous region. That's called a hole. Because this is the West. You know, Wyoming is the West. This is not Hoboken. I thought I was in another planet. That's how different it was. It was the snow, the cowboys, the horses, the guns. It was just a different world. And of course, everybody was there to ski. I'm not a skier. So I went to get away from the so-called population, get to a different population, take in the beauty of the snow, and finish my book. And I wanted to stay at a very historic hotel. So I made a reservation for February 2007 at the Wart Hotel. W-O-R-T, not W-A-R-T. You know, it's not a wart on your hand, it's the Wart. It's where they filmed Shane, which is considered by many one of the most famous Western movies. Alan Ladd and his family stayed at the Wart Hotel. I wanted to stay there. The fight scene in the movie was filmed in the bar in that hotel. So I arrived at the hotel. The dog sled took me from the airport to the hotel. We had to mush our way over. 5 feet of snow. And it was mounting by the minute. It was probably 6 feet by the time I got to the hotel. I get to the hotel, and they said, okay, your reservation, room number such and such. I go to room number such and such, and I went to turn on the lights. Now, this is a true story. And the lights did not work. If you want to leave now, you may. This is a true story. So what do you do when you check in to a hotel and the lights are not working? You pick up the phone. Usually the phone is on a stand next to your bed. And you call up the front desk and say, my lights aren't working. Isn't that what you normally do? So I picked up the phone. I said, I'm in room such and such. I like to walk around a lot. And my lights aren't working. Within a couple minutes, a maintenance man came up with a belt. And he had the hammer, the screwdriver, the wrench. He had some tools there. I didn't know what they were for. And he walked in. Now, this is the place of my story, where you could believe me or not, but I'm telling you this as it happened to me. He said to me, sir, there's nothing wrong with the electricity in your room. He put the light switch on. He said, they send me to help people who are finishing creative projects. I said, what? I said, who's they? He said, they send me to help people. Now, this man was about 40, 45 years old, and this is a true story. As true as I'm standing here, this is how it happened to me. He's about 40, 45 years old. He looked to be Filipino. I said, what's your name? Aka. A-K-A. Aka. He said, there's nothing wrong with the electricity. They had to bring us together so I could give you encouragement for this project. He and I spoke for about 15 minutes in the room, and the lights were as bright as they are in this room. And he said to me, I will be with you as long as you need, but while you're here, you have to go to Hidden Falls. I said, where's Hidden Falls? He said, it's part of Teton National Park, next to Yellowstone. Well, to make a long story short, I was in Jackson Hole for 5 days. I did not get to Hidden Falls. But about a year later, I went back to Jackson Hole for 2 nights and 3 days. Who goes to Jackson Hole for 2 nights and 3 days, other than myself? Just to go to Hidden Falls. Why Hidden Falls? Aka told me that that is where the masters gather every night, and you have to be in their energy to finish this project. And telling you that, I look at your faces, and I see wonder on some of your faces, a little skepticism on others, but belief on a third category. I was as skeptical and disbelieving as you might have been. This man was a real person who had been sent there under the pretense there was no electricity in my room. So, I go back and I finish my assignment in that I return to Jackson Hole. I need to tell you that a lot of things in my life have happened that way, where mysteriously things would take place or people would step in, and all of a sudden what seemed to be going wrong would go very right. For example, I started out in high school, and this, believe it or not, is connected to the book. In the 9th grade, I was an utter failure when I started high school. I failed 2 subjects. And you may say, well, so what? It made me a failure. I was branded a failure. But a child who's loved can do anything. And I was fully loved by my parents. And my parents never for a nanosecond allowed me to believe that failing Latin and algebra meant that I was a failure. They always separated by the Grand Canyon those two beliefs. And I was always made to believe that I was a success. A child who is loved can do anything. I am proof of that in many ways. Not too long after failing those 2 subjects and being branded by some as a failure, I'm sitting in the auditorium of A.J. Demarest High School, which was the predecessor of Hoboken High School. And I'm sitting probably as rejected as a 9th grade student could be rejected. And I'm looking at the stage. And it was an assembly of the entire school. And on the stage was a tall, thin, Cuban-American boy whose name is Leo Serrano, the husband now of Joanne Serrano. Now, I didn't know Leo at the time, but he was the president of the senior class. And that was a big deal. It was like being the football captain. And in that moment where others would have thought of me as a failure, I said, someday I want to be like Leo and on the stage as the president of my senior class. And believe me, at that moment, I was probably as far away from becoming the president of anything as anybody could. But again, a child who's loved can do anything. And I look upon all of us as children, no matter what our age is. Wasn't it Tennessee Williams who said to survive, you have to love or be loved? And I certainly was filled and surrounded and infused and drenched with love. I did become the president of my senior class 3 years later. And I went from failure to success. And I just took on the philosophy that you have to believe to see, which is the opposite of the common notion, seeing is believing. I felt that if I believe first, then I'll see. And we had this experience about 2 weeks ago with Nick and I were at a cocktail party. And when we walked in, and Nick, if I say anything that's incorrect, yell. Oh, yeah. We walked into this cocktail party. It was about 7 p.m. And it was for tomorrow's children. from Hackensack University Medical Center. It was a Thursday night, and it's a wonderful charity. They help kids who are battling cancer, and they help the families also. Nick and I walked in, and Nick's been after me for 6 months to buy a bicycle, because he wants somebody to ride around Woodridge or Hoboken with. And as we walked in, they were selling raffle tickets for one of about 20 gifts, like a basket filled with wine, or a basket of liquor, or a flat screen TV, and there was a bicycle. And Nick said, "John, here's your bicycle." And I said, "Nope." This was 7 o'clock at night. I said, "That's a bicycle for Ciara." Ciara, raise your hands, everybody. And he looked at me and he put his Nick Calabrese smile on his face, because he never laughs at me, he laughs with me. 2 hours, I put all my 6 tickets, my raffle tickets, in the bin next to the bicycle, because I could see Ciara riding that bike at 7 o'clock at night. And there were 200 people at that, 250 people at this charity event. At 9 o'clock, Nick was walking around. Nick likes to roam. He likes adventure. And he yells over to me, this is a ballroom, "John, you won the bicycle." And yeah, I knew that. I knew it was going to happen. Really, Ciara won the bicycle. And there was a roving photographer who, between 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock, 7 o'clock when we walked in and 9 o'clock when they pulled the ticket, I asked him, I said, "Will you take my picture when I win the bicycle?" He laughed at me. I said, you may laugh, but I'm going to win the bicycle. And this is not me. This is a story for all of us. Because if I can do it, you can do it. I'm no different than you are. He took the picture. He took a couple pictures of Nick and I, next to the bike, on the bike, and then we put the bike in the trunk of my new used car, and we drove to Nick's house. Nick lives in Woodridge, Bergen County. And when we were 2 blocks from the house, I said, "Is Ciara sleeping?" Nick said, "Yeah, she's probably asleep." I said, "Here's my cell phone. Wake her up." We woke her up. She came down to the front of the house. She saw us pull up. She saw us take the bike out. And what was your comment, Ciara?
Wow.
She said, "Wow." And she said a double wow when she found out the bicycle was for her. But I'm not talking about extra talents that I have. I'm saying that we all have these extra talents. They come with you. They're part of you. If I can do it, you can do it. And a child who's loved can do anything. Now, I guess it was a couple of 3 years ago, I started to write down some meditations that I do at the end of the day. And I was faced with a metaphysical problem. And a friend of mine said, you have a sense of your father. My father passed away in 1993. Why don't you ask your father that question? And I said, "My father died." And this friend of mine, Kevin Kane, said, "Your father died physically. He didn't die." So I started the practice of every night, I'll bring questions or challenges to my father. And now, about 2-3 years later, I have almost 400 pages of notes, which comprise part of my second book, which I started in June of this year. The working title is "I Go to My Father Every Night." And I bring questions and problems and challenges, and the answers I get from my father are uncanny in their accuracy, in their analysis, in the pinpoint answers. This is nothing vague. This is specific, precise answers that I get. Please ask me a question or make a comment. Kevo King.
How does this relate to learning English?
Well, it relates to it in this sense, and that's also a good. I haven't heard a bad question tonight. Well, it's a high five.
Thank you.
It talks about the intuitive quality, which we all have, but most of us think we don't. When you hear the word intuition, oh, that's for special people. I believe all of us are special, and I believe all of us are intuitive, and that's the part of the person that this book is tapping into. This book doesn't treat ESL students as though they know nothing. This treats ESL students as though they're intelligent people who know so much that just has to be gently brought out. So it's the intuitive quality. Comments? Nikki?
John, have you spoken to or have known Americans that went to Europe, Germany or France, and learned their language? Did you speak
Americans?
to them?
Yeah.
How did they learn?
The nice thing about foreign education, that's another good question. The nice thing about foreign education, foreign language education in America is that you're required to spend your junior year abroad. Great experience I had. When I was a junior undergraduate at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, my roommate, a fellow by the name of Joe Mantaneo, left the room in September. So I would be alone in the room from September until the following May. When he left in September, he was Joe Mantaneo, a kid from Fairview, from an Italian-American family, just as I came from a Sicilian-American family. When Joe Mantaneo came back to that same dormitory room in May of the following year, I did not recognize him. Because of the requirement to live in the foreign country and attend a university in the foreign country, Joe Mantaneo had become Italian. He lived in Rome. He went to the University of Roma. Actually, when he came back the following, where's my jacket? I think I put it in the back. I want to demonstrate this. When Joe Mantaneo came back after being in Italy for a year, he not only grew a mustache, but he wore his coat like this. He had a swagger to him. He had a cigarette in a holder. Joe Mantaneo had become Italian. He was immersed. He was so different. What I see now with the ESL students, I see many of them are taught by what I call textbook teachers in their foreign country. Teachers who have never set foot in America. They learned English through a textbook. They were teaching chapter by chapter English in a country 8,000 miles from America. So there was a big difference. And I was amazed at the change. Joe Mantaneo, I was told, after a year in Italy, spoke perfect Italian. And he went on to have a career of teaching Italian at Dumont High School. What a difference. That's not a difference that you can get by staying in your culture. It's a difference that answers the question that John Goldsmith asked a few moments ago. If you're still part of the ethnic culture, you have to get out of it. Mm-hmm. You have to get into the American culture. Even though you feel uncomfortable, the uncomfortability will only last a little while. It's like going to see a first American movie and not understanding most of it. You go a second, third time. By the end of 6 or 7 months, 6 or 7 movies, you'll amaze yourself. I understand so much more now than I did then. It's taking the first step. What I did when I was at South Pole Laugh at me if you will, because I laughed at myself. About 2005, 2006, I decided to take ice skating lessons. So I went to the ice house in Hackensack. I was like this on ice skates. I wanted to try a sport where I would feel uncomfortable, where I would feel uneasy, so I could empathize with my students. I remember the teacher, the tutor, the ice skating tutor said to me, okay, lace up, I'll meet you on the ice. Now the ice was maybe 12 feet away from the bench. I said, I can't, I'll lace up on the ice. She said to me, no, 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 no. Lace up and walk over. I said, I can't do that. She said, that's your first lesson, John, and she skated away from me. I laced up. I just about made it to the ice, and then I realized the ice is very slippery. And it's very hard also. There's nothing soft about ice. Now, she was very kind to me, but she gave me a tough lesson. You have to do it. You have to get on the ice. You have to go to the movie. You have to shop in the American supermarket. Even if you buy nothing, you have to get into the culture. If you stay in the Korean culture, the Japanese culture, the Hispanic culture, by doing all your shopping, you're never going to learn English, because part of what you have to learn is the culture. And in learning the culture, you learn the language by osmosis, so to speak. Taking ice skating lessons, and by the way, at the end of, I don't know, a year, I could actually ice skate. Do you remember once, Anna Maria, we talked about ice skating in Hoboken? I could actually ice skate. It was amazing, but I wanted to feel uncomfortable so I would have more understanding of my students. And it worked. Comments, questions, please. Regina,
Yes.
who's in the middle of a move in Manhattan, but she found time to come here tonight. Thank you.
Well, what's interesting is where I just moved to, I haven't moved in it yet because it's being fixed up. And the two guys that are working like really all day and night, they're from Kazakhstan or one of those places. And their English, I can watch them translating from their from Russian to English. There's like an absolute delay in when I speak to them and they speak back to me, because their English is very minimal. And I can see, I know that there's a delay because they're translating.
Sure.
And I actually offered them today if they wanted, because the wife of the super cannot speak English, because I was told to bring some paint over, and she opened the door and she couldn't say, my husband is not here. She just opened the door and looked at me. She couldn't say it. He's like, so the point I'm making is they're really nice and they're really doing a great job, and they're really embarrassed about speaking English.
Yeah, that's the thing. Embarrassment, because I found my students are afraid to open their mouths in front of an English-speaking person because they may be laughed at, ridiculed. Therefore, we continue shopping in our ethnic store. We continue going to our church where they speak our language. You know, we stay where we think we'll be comfortable, but you're really just not helping yourself. You have to get into the... If you've made a decision to stay here in America, you have to get into the culture. And the faster you do it, the better. Now, I was going to read passages from my book, but I decided not to do that, because I thought this would be more human. Besides reading passages, I run the risk that you might fall asleep while I'm reading. And I'd rather have you fall asleep while I'm telling you these stories. Yes, in Hope Park.
I have two questions.
Yes. Now, you're only allowed one.
And these two are related with Regina's first question. Who was the main audience that you were thinking when you wrote this book? And you said that there are multiple cultures, particularly from large part of Asia, Korea, as well as Spanish and other cultures. Sounds like that.
Is that two questions? Or what? It's one.
Actually, my first question is, it sounds like that you figured out there's a difference between how to, let's say, influence culturally to teach English between or amongst different cultures. My second question is, it almost sounds like that. First of all, I absolutely agree with you because I was one of your students. I absolutely agree with cultural aspects of learning English. But at the same time, what would you say to the student or other, let's say, Korean people who never experienced American, let's say, culture directly in this country?
Well, to the second question, first, I'd say buy my book. To the first question, I always think of my Sicilian grandmother. If she could come back to physical being and look at this group, I think she'd say to you, study English, study the culture. Don't do as I did. My Sicilian grandmother, her name was Mama Galeota. She lived here for 72 years. When she died at the age of 92, she spoke no English. Now you may say, that's impossible. It's not impossible. It's happening every day inside many of several ghettos in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area. If you stay inside that, you don't learn. And I always think of her. She would give you advice. Please, learn English, learn the culture. Anna, was your hand up?
Yes. I want to say my parents came from Italy about 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And my dad had to get a job and just jumped right into the culture of American society. And he speaks very well English. He actually does not speak to any of us in Italian, which we were all taught to speak Italian. He does not speak to any of us in Italian. He debates my husband all the time. He's very, very good. On the other hand, my mom, who has been here just as long, is like John's grandmother. Does not speak one word of English.
Isn't that interesting? How many years is that? 50, did you say?
50 years. Yet, there's a side of her that has accepted the way, we live. She's on a bus every day. She will go shopping in New York, West New York, Union City, goes to the supermarkets. But it's like when she gets home, she goes right back to her ways of, just like her culture, of the Italian culture. And I suppose in a way we enabled her to learn to speak English because we were just there, just picking up, whatever she needed or, helping her out in that way. And I think that she's kind of sad in a way that, she just can't get into conversations with us anymore. We're
She might be.
translating. She'd like to, but we're constantly translating.
She might be. Now, my grandmother couldn't speak to any of her 27 grandchildren. I was one of 27. And none of us knew enough Italian to speak to her. So she had the same regret that your mom has now. See how a big chunk. Now, Anna's mom and my grandmother are certainly in two different eras. They're two different age groups. But if you could understand how many people are like that, you'd be amazed. If you go to a place like Palisades Park, if I blindfolded you and took you to Palisade Park and then took the blindfold off, you would think you're in a foreign country. And that's where I was an English teacher, and then I was a vice principal for 27 years. John.
So your theory is, in part, that you should be more like your grandfather than your grandmother. And
You could say that,
force
yes.
yourself to go out
Yes.
and interact and learn the culture and learn the language.
Yes.
Do you have a view about whether a town like Palisade Park, or pick a town like, is it North Plainfield that has a pretty high population of Indian people. Does that provide false comfort for the people that move there? Because if they want to, they can stay in their old culture.
Very comfortably, they could stay in their culture, you're right.
But on the other hand, you can't discourage people from opening Korean groceries or, that's because they don't like American food or whatever, they don't know it. I mean, the bigger question, how do you encourage the people who want to stay in their house? How, is it just this positive thinking that you just got to go out there and believe you can do it?
The encouragement is to make people welcome and to realize that these people are no different than we are. And the language barrier is certainly there, but encouragement, friendliness, there's no difference between us. It can be done. We had tremendous success at South Pole making people feel comfortable and making people feel that if they came into the American culture, I'm not the only American that welcomes Korean people. But not all American people are ogres. They're not all unfriendly. There are American people who will with open arms welcome you. I think it's a matter of time. Mark?
Yes. I would like to ask you about your experience with the age of the students, because when you are a teenager, it seems like it's very easy to learn a language. But when you are older and older,
yeah. So
how
age.
can you tell people that are old to encourage?
Okay, one of my most interesting students, because besides working at South Pole, and I've talked about South Pole a lot tonight, because it's, for me, a wonderful and a rich experience with people. I rented space in a Jewish synagogue in Fort Lee. I'm not Jewish, but it made no difference to the rabbi. He welcomed me with open arms. One of my most interesting students there was an 82-year-old lady, Korean lady named Margaret, who never missed a class. She had suffered a stroke a year or two before I met her. She was one of the most diligent students I had. Margaret, I remember she lived on McElroy Street in Fort Lee, and she doesn't know it, but she inspired me every day. I looked for her. I think I met her class 2 or 3 times a week. I looked for her. And once or twice, she might have been late, but that was only because there was 6 or 8 inches of snow on the ground. But she never was absent. So we could use age as a barrier, but it's an artificial barrier. I mean, think of Margaret. Just think of what she did. She was a grandma several times over. The bad weather never stopped her. But it's determination, because nothing beats determination. And you have to have determination in your heart and soul. And it's not too late. It's not too late. It's never too late. Yes, Joe Brennan.
You know how you mentioned embarrassment is difficult when you immerse yourself in something. And I found that if you just, and doesn't vary from culture to culture is the fact that everyone has an ego. And if you take the ego away, then it's a lot less embarrassing. But if they don't see it as such, then they think it's just like confrontational, or that they're being hurt or embarrassed. But if you keep the ego in check, the embarrassment doesn't get as much activity.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree fully with that. That's why one message I tried to get through tonight relative to that is that we're all one. We're all connected. And there's really no need, or it's silly to have an ego to set you aside. If you look upon us as we're all one and we're connected and we're really here to help each other, that changes the energy. every morning, I mentioned earlier, every morning I do 5,000 steps in Hoboken. And I usually go out anywhere between 6 and 8 a.m. Usually closer to 6 a.m. when people are going to catch a bus in Hoboken, or going to get the path station. Sometimes you see mothers pushing the baby carriages to drop the babies with babysitters. I say good morning to everybody. Everybody. Some people respond, other people don't. And I realize for some people, I'm the only person who's going to wish them a good morning. Everybody who passes me, and passing me could be 10, 15 feet away. Good morning, and I keep walking. Everybody gets a good morning. I'd say maybe 50% of the people respond. The other 50% probably think I'm nuts, or maybe they're in a morning mood where they don't want to talk. But everybody who passes me gets a good morning. Yes, please.
You know,
Good question, Joe.
That's very interesting. You know, that's a perfect example. Here we are now, on the second night of Hanukkah. That is a perfect example of what's called tikkun olam, that is to say, to repair the world. And it doesn't have to be a big thing. You know, that's a perfect example of that. It could be just a smile, you know, to hold the door open for somebody instead of let it slam in their face. Good morning. How are you? I mean, really look in their eyes and say that and mean that when you say, how are you? You know, stuff like that. That helps to repair the world. But
repair, you said repair.
To repair the world.
Repair
Tikkun olam. And everyone, no one is off the hook to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's not just for Jewish people, that is for everyone. Kabbalah teaches that. But anyway, what I wanted to say was, do you find, I don't know, I've lived in different parts of the country. Now, maybe I have seen it through the eyes of a child, and I'm sure folks will have a different take on it. Now, I lived in Texas. That's really more the Southwest than the Deep South. But when I came up here when I was 8 years old, and I just remember thinking, you know, like the people I knew in Texas, collectively, would they'd be like that. They'd give you the shirt off their back. They'd go even beyond that. And when I came up here, I was like, what's wrong with people? What's the matter with them, you know? I don't think it's that people aren't nice here in the Northeast, but I think that I don't know, there's kind of a reserve here that exists. The New York, New Jersey metropolitan area, like you say, some people don't answer you at all or think you're strange or weird, you know. But, man, I used to, initially, I saw it through the eyes of a child, and initially I just came home from school crying, and so I was like, what's the matter with these people?
Well, I made a decision. If people think I'm strange and weird, wishing them good morning.
That's their problem.
It's okay.
That's right.
No, I don't mind if they think I'm, you know, maybe I am strange and weird, but I'm going to continue saying good morning.
That's right.
And I start as I leave my house, because when I leave my house, I have to take my key out to double bolt the door. Good morning. And in the winter, of course, I wear a ski cap and a hood, usually a red hood. I wash it occasionally, and sweatpants and sneakers, and I don't care. You know, if we do little things like that, I agree with you. It makes a big difference, because we're not heads of countries
It adds up.
that we can affect thousands of people. But if we affect the people who come into our lives during the course of a day,
Grassroots level.
every day, that's a lot of people.
That's right.
You know, they haven't made me president or ambassador yet. Good question. Anything else? Because I see Matt in the back. He has a big hook, and he's ready to hook me and bring me out. If you haven't had a tapas yet, if we have any left, I think we do have tapas left. Please take one to go home. Joanne Serena, do you realize what you did by inviting me? You realize?
Yes, I do.
You are the person to whom I give credit, because if we've advanced our oneness even a little bit, it's because of that lady back there. And it was only a couple of 3 years ago that I told her husband the story about him inspiring me when we were high school kids.
Yeah, she did tell me. Can I just say one thing?
Please.
When my husband came to this country, he came from Cuba with his parents. He was 7 years old. There were no bilingual programs. My husband was put back in the first grade in Joseph F. Brand School, and that's how he learned English. He had a teacher who was very dedicated to him, and he doesn't have an accent. George
No,
doesn't
he
have
speaks
an accent.
perfect English.
Yes.
And there are other people in here from Cuba who don't have an accent. It's determination. It's getting in the culture.
Yes.
And it's funny, my preface talks about when I was a 6th grade boy in Joseph F. Brand School. One day my teacher, Mrs. Bettini, said to me, "Johnny, come up to my desk." So I went up to her desk, not knowing what she was going to ask me, and she said, "Tomorrow, we have a new student coming from Molfetta, Italy. I want you to be his helper." This is the preface of this book. And I said, "Oh, is that right, Mrs. Bettini?" Now, I knew of Molfetta because many Italians in Hoboken were from Molfetta. They're Molfettese, okay? She said, "As of tomorrow, I want you to be his helper." Now, his name is Joe Zan. Joe Zan, and then the next day, Mrs. Bettini pulled his chair next to mine, and we became friends. To this day, we're friends. He lives in Woodridge, a couple blocks from Nick Calabrese, and Joe wanted to come tonight, but he's selling his house, and he's in the midst of that. So, but he knows he's in the book, and he's given me permission to be in the book. That's how I started my ESL. And Joanne's right, it wasn't called ESL. It didn't exist. It was helping foreign-born students. ESL is something new. You think my father had ESL when he came to Hoboken in the early 1900s? ESL, they didn't even know what it meant. Thank you, Joanne, for inviting me. Thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful holiday season.